Chapter 43. So important did Theobald consider this matter that he made a special journey to Rubborough before the half-year began. It was a relief to have him out of the house, but though his destination was not mentioned, Ernest guessed where he had gone. To this day he considers his conduct at this crisis to have been one of the most serious latches of his life, one which he can never think of without shame and indignation. He says he ought to have run away from home. But what good could he have done if he had? He would have been caught, brought back and examined 2 days later instead of 2 days earlier. A boy of barely 16 cannot stand against the moral pressure of a father and mother who have always oppressed him any more than he can cope physically with a powerful full-grown man. True, he may allow himself to be killed rather than yield, but this is being so morbidly heroic as to come close round again to cowardice, for it is little else than suicide, which is universally condemned as cowardly. On the reassembling of the school it became apparent that something had gone wrong. Dr. Skinner called the boys together, and with much pomp excommunicated Mrs. Cross and Mrs. Jones, by declaring their shops to be out of bounds. The street in which the Swan and Bottle stood was also forbidden. The vices of drinking and smoking, therefore, were clearly aimed at, and before prayers Dr. Skinner spoke a few impressive words about the abominable sin of using bad language. Ernest's feelings can be imagined. Next day at the hour when the daily punishments were read out, though there had not yet been time for him to have offended, Ernest Pontifex was declared to have incurred every punishment which the school provided for evildoers. He was placed on the idle list for the whole half-year, and on perpetual detentions. His bounds were curtailed, he was to attend junior callings over, in fact he was so hemmed in with punishments upon every side that it was hardly possible for him to go outside the school gates. This unparalleled list of punishments inflicted on the first day of the half-year, and intended to last till the ensuing Christmas holidays, was not connected with any specified offense. It required no great penetration therefore, on the part of the boys to connect Ernest with the putting Mrs. Cross's and Mrs. Jones's shops out of bounds. Great indeed was the indignation about Mrs. Cross who, it was known, remembered Dr. Skinner himself as a small boy only just got into jackets, and had doubtless let him have many a sausage and mashed potatoes upon deferred payment. The head boys assembled in conclave to consider what steps should be taken. But hardly had they done so before Ernest knocked timidly at the head-room door and took the bull by the horns by explaining the facts as far as he could bring himself to do so. He made a clean breast of everything except about the school list and the remarks he had made about each boy's character. This infamy was more than he could own to, and he kept his counsel concerning it. Fortunately he was safe in doing so, for Dr. Skinner, pedant and more than pedant though he was, had still just sense enough to turn on Theobald in the matter of the school list. Whether he resented being told that he did not know the characters of his own boys, or whether he dreaded a scandal about the school I know not, but when Theobald had handed him the list, over which he had expended so much pains, Dr. Skinner had cut him uncommonly short, and had then and there, with more suavity than was usual with him, committed it to the flames before Theobald's own eyes. Ernest got off with the head boys easier than he expected. It was admitted that the offense, heinous though it was, had been committed under extenuating circumstances. The frankness with which the culprit had confessed all, his evidently unfeigned remorse, and the fury with which Dr. Skinner was pursuing him tended to bring about a reaction in his favor, as though he had been more sinned against than sinning. As the half-year wore on his spirits gradually revived, and when attacked by one of his fits of self-abasement he was in some degree consoled by having found out that even his father and mother, whom he had supposed so immaculate, were no better than they should be. About the 5th of November it was a school custom to meet on a certain common not far from Rubborough and burn somebody in effigy, this being the compromise arrived at in the matter of fireworks and Guy Fawkes festivities. This year it was decided that Pontifex's governor should be the victim, and Ernest, though a good deal exercised in mind as to what he ought to do, in the end saw no sufficient reason for holding aloof from proceedings which, as he justly remarked, could not do his father any harm. It so happened that the bishop had held a confirmation at the school on the 5th of November. Dr. Skinner had not quite liked the selection of this day, but the bishop was pressed by many engagements, and had been compelled to make the arrangement as it then stood. Ernest was among those who had to be confirmed, and was deeply impressed with the solemn importance of the ceremony. When he felt the huge old bishop drawing down upon him as he knelt in chapel, he could hardly breathe, and when the apparition paused before him and laid its hands upon his head, he was frightened almost out of his wits. He felt that he had arrived at one of the great turning points of his life, and that the Ernest of the future could resemble only very faintly the Ernest of the past. This happened at about noon, but by the 1 o'clock dinner hour the effect of the confirmation had worn off, and he saw no reason why he should forego his annual amusement with the bonfire, so he went with the others and was very valiant till the image was actually produced and was about to be burnt. Then he felt a little frightened. It was a poor thing enough, made of paper, calico and straw, but they had christened it the Reverend Theobald Pontifex, and he had a revulsion of feeling as he saw it being carried towards the bonfire. Still he held his ground, and in a few minutes, when all was over, felt none the worse for having assisted at a ceremony which, after all, was prompted by a boyish love of mischief rather than by rancor. I should say that Ernest had written to his father, and told him of the unprecedented way in which he was being treated. He even ventured to suggest that Theobald should interfere for his protection, and reminded him how the story had been got out of him, but Theobald had had enough of Dr. Skinner for the present. The burning of the school list had been a rebuff which did not encourage him to meddle a second time in the internal economics of Rubborough. He therefore replied that he must either remove Ernest from Rubborough altogether, which would for many reasons be undesirable, or trust to the discretion of the headmaster as regards the treatment he might think best for any of his pupils. Ernest said no more. He still felt that it was so discreditable to him to have allowed any confession to be wrung from him, that he could not press the promised amnesty for himself. It was during the Mother Cross Row, as it was long styled among the boys, that a remarkable phenomenon was witnessed at Rubborough. I mean that of the head boys under certain conditions doing errands for their juniors. The head boys had no bounds and could go to Mrs. Cross's whenever they liked. They actually, therefore, made themselves go-betweens, and would get anything from either Mrs. Cross's or Mrs. Jones's for any boy, no matter how low in the school, between the hours of 8:45 and 9 in the morning, and 5:45 and 6 in the afternoon. By degrees, however, the boys grew bolder, and the shops, though not openly declared in bounds again, were tacitly allowed to be so. Chapter 44. I may spare the reader more details about my hero's school days. He rose, always in spite of himself, into the doctor's form, and for the last 2 years or so of his time was among the praposters, though he never rose into the upper half of them. He did little, and I think the doctor rather gave him up as a boy whom he had better leave to himself, for he rarely made him construe, and he used to send in his exercises or not, pretty much as he liked. His tacit, unconscious obstinacy had in time effected more even than a few bold sallies in the first instance would have done. To the end of his career his position in Terperes was what it had been at the beginning, namely, among the upper part of the less reputable class, whether of seniors or juniors, rather than among the lower part of the more respectable. Only once in the whole course of his school life did he get praise from Dr. Skinner for any exercise, and this he has treasured as the best example of guarded approval which he has ever seen. He had had to write a copy of Alca Ix on the dogs of the monks of St. Bernard, and when the exercise was returned to him he found the doctor had written on it, "In this copy of Alca Ix, which is still excessively bad, I fancy that I can discern some faint symptoms of improvement." Ernest says that if the exercise was any better than usual it must have been by a fluke, for he is sure that he always liked dogs, especially St. Bernard dogs, far too much to take any pleasure in writing Alca Ix about them. As I look back upon it, he said to me but the other day, with a hearty laugh, I respect myself more for having never once got the best mark for an exercise than I should do if I had got it every time it could be got. I am glad nothing could make me do Latin and Greek verses. I am glad Skinner could never get any moral influence over me. I am glad I was idle at school, and I am glad my father overtasked me as a boy, otherwise, likely enough I should have acquiesced in the swindle, and might have written as good a copy of Alcaix about the dogs of the monks of St. Bernard as my neighbors, and yet I don't know, for I remember there was another boy, who sent in a Latin copy of some sort, but for his own pleasure he wrote the following: "The dogs of the monks of St. Bernard go to pick little children out of the snow, and around their necks is the cordial gin tied with a little bit of bobbin." I should like to have written that, and I did try, but I couldn't. I didn't quite like the last line, and tried to mend it, but I couldn't. I fancied I could see traces of bitterness against the instructors of his youth in Ernest's manner, and said something to this effect. "Oh, no," he replied, still laughing, "no more than Saint Anthony felt towards the devils who had tempted him, when he met some of them casually 100 or a couple of 100 years afterwards. Of course he knew they were devils, but that was all right enough. There must be devils. Saint Anthony probably liked these devils better than most others, and for old acquaintance sake showed them as much indulgence as was compatible with decorum. Besides, you know," he added, "Saint Anthony tempted the devils quite as much as they tempted him, for his peculiar sanctity was a greater temptation to tempt him than they could stand. Strictly speaking, it was the devils who were the more to be pitied, for they were led up by Saint Anthony to be tempted and fell, whereas Saint Anthony did not fall. I believe I was a disagreeable and unintelligible boy, and if ever I meet Skinner there is no one whom I would shake hands with, or do a good turn to more readily." At home things went on rather better. The Ellen and Mother Cross rose sank slowly down upon the horizon, and even at home he had quieter times now that he had become a praposter. Nevertheless the watchful eye and protecting hand were still ever over him to guard his comings in and his goings out, and to spy out all his ways. Is it wonderful that the boy, though always trying to keep up appearances as though he were cheerful and contented, and at times actually being so, wore often an anxious, jaded look when he thought none were looking, which told of an almost incessant conflict within? Doubtless Theobald saw these looks and knew how to interpret them, but it was his profession to know how to shut his eyes to things that were inconvenient. No clergyman could keep his benefice for a month if he could not do this. Besides, he had allowed himself for so many years to say things he ought not to have said, and not to say the things he ought to have said, that he was little likely to see anything that he thought it more convenient not to see unless he was made to do so. It was not much that was wanted. To make no mysteries where nature has made none, to bring his conscience under something like reasonable control, to give Ernest his head a little more, to ask fewer questions, and to give him pocket money with a desire that it should be spent upon menus pleasures. Call that not much indeed, laughed Ernest, as I read him what I have just written. Why, it is the whole duty of a father, but it is the mystery-making which is the worst evil. If people would dare to speak to one another unreservedly, there would be a good deal less sorrow in the world 100 years hence. To return, however, to Rubbera. On the day of his leaving, when he was sent for into the library to be shaken hands with, he was surprised to feel that, though assuredly glad to leave, he did not do so with any especial grudge against the doctor rankling in his breast. He had come to the end of it all, and was still alive, nor, take it all round, more seriously amiss than other people. Dr. Skinner received him graciously, and was even frolicsome after his own heavy fashion. Young people are almost always placable, and Ernest felt as he went away that another such interview would not only have wiped off all old scores, but have brought him round into the ranks of the doctor's admirers and supporters, among whom it is only fair to say that the greater number of the more promising boys were found. Just before saying goodbye the doctor actually took down a volume from those shelves which had seemed so awful 6 years previously, and gave it to him after having written his name in it, and the words, Greek text, which I believe means with all kind wishes from the donor. The book was one written in Latin by a German, Schumann, De Comitiis Atheniensibus, not exactly light and cheerful reading, but Ernest felt it was high time he got to understand the Athenian constitution and manner of voting. He had got them up a great many times already, but had forgotten them as fast as he had learned them. Now, however, that the doctor had given him this book, he would master the subject once for all. How strange it was! He wanted to remember these things very badly, he knew he did, but he could never retain them. In spite of himself, they no sooner fell upon his mind than they fell off it again. He had such a dreadful memory, whereas, if anyone played him a piece of music and told him where it came from, he never forgot that, though he made no effort to retain it, and was not even conscious of trying to remember it at all. His mind must be badly formed, and he was no good. Having still a short time to spare, he got the keys of St. Michael's Church and went to have a farewell practice upon the organ, which he could now play fairly well. He walked up and down the aisle for a while in a meditative mood, and then, settling down to the organ, played "They a Loath to Drink of the River" about 6 times over, after which he felt more composed and happier. Then, tearing himself away from the instrument he loved so well, he hurried to the station. As the train drew out, he looked down from a high embankment onto the little house his aunt had taken, and where it might be said she had died through her desire to do him a kindness. There were the 2 well-known bow windows, out of which he had often stepped to run across the lawn into the workshop. He reproached himself with the little gratitude he had shown towards this kind lady, the only one of his relations whom he had ever felt as though he could have taken into his confidence. Dearly as he loved her memory, he was glad she had not known the scrapes he had got into since she died. Perhaps she might not have forgiven them, and how awful that would have been. But then, if she had lived, perhaps many of his ills would have been spared him. As he mused thus, he grew sad again. Where, he asked himself, was it all to end? Was it to be always sin, shame and sorrow in the future, as it had been in the past, and the ever-watchful eye and protecting hand of his father laying burdens on him greater than he could bear, or was he, too, some day or another to come to feel that he was fairly well and happy? There was a grey mist across the sun, so that the eye could bear its light, and Ernest, while musing as above, was looking right into the middle of the sun himself, as into the face of one whom he knew and was fond of. At first his face was grave, but kindly, as of a tired man who feels that a long task is over, but in a few seconds the more humorous side of his misfortunes presented itself to him, and he smiled half reproachfully, half merrily, as thinking how little all that had happened to him really mattered, and how small were his hardships as compared with those of most people. Still looking into the eye of the sun and smiling dreamily, he thought how he had helped to burn his father in effigy, and his look grew merrier, till at last he broke out into a laugh. Exactly at this moment the light veil of cloud parted from the sun, and he was brought to terra firma by the breaking forth of the sunshine. On this he became aware that he was being watched attentively by a fellow traveler opposite to him, an elderly gentleman with a large head and iron grey hair. "My young friend," said he, good-naturedly, "you really must not carry on conversations with people in the sun, while you are in a public railway carriage." The old gentleman said not another word, but unfolded his Times and began to read it. As for Ernest, he blushed crimson. The pair did not speak during the rest of the time they were in the carriage, but they eyed each other from time to time, so that the face of each was impressed on the recollection of the other. Chapter 45. Some people say that their school days were the happiest of their lives. They may be right, but I always look with suspicion upon those whom I hear saying this. It is hard enough to know whether one is happy or unhappy now, and still harder to compare the relative happiness or unhappiness of different times of one's life. The utmost that can be said is that we are fairly happy so long as we are not distinctly aware of being miserable. As I was talking with Ernest one day not so long since about this, he said he was so happy now that he was sure he had never been happier, and did not wish to be so, but that Cambridge was the first place where he had ever been consciously and continuously happy. How can any boy fail to feel an ecstasy of pleasure on first finding himself in rooms which he knows for the next few years are to be his castle? Here he will not be compelled to turn out of the most comfortable place as soon as he has ensconced himself in it because Papa or Mama happens to come into the room, and he should give it up to them. The most cozy chair here is for himself, there is no one even to share the room with him, or to interfere with his doing as he likes in it, smoking included. Why, if such a room looked out both back and front onto a blank dead wall it would still be a paradise. How much more then when the view is of some quiet grassy court or cloister or garden, as from the windows of the greater number of rooms at Oxford and Cambridge. Theobald, as an old fellow and tutor of Emmanuel, at which college he had entered earnest, was able to obtain from the present tutor a certain preference in the choice of rooms. Ernest's, therefore, were very pleasant ones, looking out upon the grassy court that is bounded by the Fellows' Gardens. Theobald accompanied him to Cambridge, and was at his best while doing so. He liked the jaunt, and even he was not without a certain feeling of pride in having a full-blown son at the university. Some of the reflected rays of this splendor were allowed to fall upon Ernest himself. Theobald said he was willing to hope, this was one of his tags, that his son would turn over a new leaf now that he had left school, and for his own part he was only too ready. This was another tag, to let bygones be bygones. Ernest, not yet having his name on the books, was able to dine with his father at the fellows' table of one of the other colleges on the invitation of an old friend of Theobald's. He there made acquaintance with sundry of the good things of this life, the very names of which were new to him, and felt as he ate them that he was now indeed receiving a liberal education. When at length the time came for him to go to Emmanuel, where he was to sleep in his new rooms, his father came with him to the gates and saw him safe into college. A few minutes more and he found himself alone in a room for which he had a latchkey. From this time he dated many days which, if not quite unclouded, were upon the whole very happy ones. I need not however describe them, as the life of a quiet steady-going undergraduate has been told in a score of novels better than I can tell it. Some of Ernest's schoolfellows came up to Cambridge at the same time as himself, and with these he continued on friendly terms during the whole of his college career. Other schoolfellows were only a year or two his seniors, these called on him, and he thus made a sufficiently favorable entrée into college life. A straightforwardness of character that was stamped upon his face, a love of humor, and a temper which was more easily appeased than ruffled made up for some awkwardness and want of savoir-faire. He soon became a not unpopular member of the best set of his year, and though neither capable of becoming, nor aspiring to become, a leader, was admitted by the leaders as among their nearer hangers-on. Of ambition he had at that time not one particle. Greatness, or indeed superiority of any kind, seemed so far off and incomprehensible to him that the idea of connecting it with himself never crossed his mind. If he could escape the notice of all those with whom he did not feel himself en rapport, he conceived that he had triumphed sufficiently. He did not care about taking a good degree, except that it must be good enough to keep his father and mother quiet. He did not dream of being able to get a fellowship. If he had, he would have tried hard to do so, for he became so fond of Cambridge that he could not bear the thought of having to leave it. The briefness indeed of the season during which his present happiness was to last was almost the only thing that now seriously troubled him. Having less to attend to in the matter of growing, and having got his head more free, he took to reading fairly well, not because he liked it, but because he was told he ought to do so, and his natural instinct, like that of all very young men who are good for anything, was to do as those in authority told him. The intention at Battersby was, for Dr. Skinner had said that Ernest could never get a fellowship, that he should take a sufficiently good degree to be able to get a tutorship or a mastership in some school preparatory to taking orders. When he was 21 years old his money was to come into his own hands, and the best thing he could do with it would be to buy the next presentation to a living, the rector of which was now old, and live on his mastership or tutorship till the living fell in. He could buy a very good living for the sum which his grandfather's legacy now amounted to, for Theobald had never had any serious intention of making deductions for his son's maintenance and education, and the money had accumulated till it was now about £5,000. He had only talked about making deductions in order to stimulate the boy to exertion as far as possible, by making him think that this was his only chance of escaping starvation, or perhaps from pure love of teasing. When Ernest had a living of £600 or £700 a year with a house, and not too many parishioners, why, he might add to his income by taking pupils, or even keeping a school, and then, say at 30, he might marry. It was not easy for Theobald to hit on any much more sensible plan. He could not get Ernest into business, for he had no business connections. Besides, he did not know what business meant. He had no interest. Again, at the bar, medicine was a profession which subjected its students to ordeals and temptations which these fond parents shrank from on behalf of their boy. He would be thrown among companions and familiarized with details which might sully him, and though he might stand, it was only too possible that he would fall. Besides, ordination was the road which Theobald knew and understood, and indeed the only road about which he knew anything at all, so not unnaturally it was the one he chose for Ernest. The foregoing had been instilled into my hero from earliest boyhood, much as it had been instilled into Theobald himself, and with the same result, the conviction, namely, that he was certainly to be a clergyman, but that it was a long way off yet, and he supposed it was all right. As for the duty of reading hard, and taking as good a degree as he could, this was plain enough, so he set himself to work, as I have said, steadily, and to the surprise of everyone as well as himself got a college scholarship, of no great value, but still a scholarship, in his freshman's term. It is hardly necessary to say that Theobald stuck to the whole of this money, believing the pocket money he allowed Ernest to be sufficient for him, and knowing how dangerous it was for young men to have money at command. I do not suppose it even occurred to him to try and remember what he had felt when his father took a like course in regard to himself. Ernest's position in this respect was much what it had been at school, except that things were on a larger scale. His tutors' and cook's bills were paid for him, his father sent him his wine. Over and above this he had £50 a year with which to keep himself in clothes and all other expenses. This was about the usual thing at Emmanuel in Ernest's day, though many had much less than this. Ernest did as he had done at school, he spent what he could. Soon after he received his money, he then incurred a few modest liabilities, and then lived penuriously till next term, when he would immediately pay his debts, and start new ones to much the same extent as those which he had just got rid of. When he came into his £5,000 and became independent of his father, £15 or £20 served to cover the whole of his unauthorized expenditure. He joined the boat club, and was constant in his attendance at the boats. He still smoked, but never took more wine or beer than was good for him, except perhaps on the occasion of a boating supper. But even then he found the consequences unpleasant, and soon learned how to keep within safe limits. He attended chapel as often as he was compelled to do so. He communicated 2 or 3 times a year, because his tutor told him he ought to. In fact, he set himself to live soberly and cleanly, as I imagine all his instincts prompted him to do, and when he fell, as who that is born of woman can help sometimes doing ? It was not till after a sharp tussle with a temptation that was more than his flesh and blood could stand, then he was very penitent and would go a fairly long while without sinning again, and this was how it had always been with him since he had arrived at years of indiscretion. Even to the end of his career at Cambridge he was not aware that he had it in him to do anything, but others had begun to see that he was not wanting in ability and sometimes told him so. He did not believe it. Indeed, he knew very well that if they thought him clever they were being taken in, but it pleased him to have been able to take them in, and he tried to do so still further. He was therefore a good deal on the lookout for cants that he could catch and apply in season, and might have done himself some mischief thus if he had not been ready to throw over any cant as soon as he had come across another more nearly to his fancy. His friends used to say that when he rose he flew like a snipe, darting several times in various directions before he settled down to a steady straight flight, but when he had once got into this he would keep to it. Chapter 46 When he was in his third year, a magazine was founded at Cambridge, the contributions to which were exclusively by undergraduates. Ernest sent in an essay upon the Greek drama, which he has declined to let me reproduce here without his being allowed to re-edit it. I have therefore been unable to give it in its original form, but when pruned of its redundancies, and this is all that has been done to it, it runs as follows. I shall not attempt within the limits at my disposal to make a resume of the rise and progress of the Greek drama, but will confine myself to considering whether the reputation enjoyed by the three chief Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, is one that will be permanent, or whether they will one day be held to have been overrated. Why, I ask myself, do I see much that I can easily admire in Homer, Thucydides, Herodotus, Demosthenes, Aristophanes, Theocritus, parts of Lucretius, Horace's satires and epistles, to say nothing of other ancient writers, and yet find myself at once repelled by even those works of Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides which are most generally admired? With the first-named writers I am in the hands of men who feel, if not as I do, still as I can understand their feeling, and as I am interested to see that they should have felt. With the second I have so little sympathy that I cannot understand how anyone can ever have taken any interest in them whatever. Their highest flights to me are dull, pompous and artificial productions, which, if they were to appear now for the first time, would, I should think, either fall dead or be severely handled by the critics. I wish to know whether it is I who am in fault in this matter, or whether part of the blame may not rest with the tragedians themselves. How far, I wonder, did the Athenians genuinely like these poets, and how far was the applause which was lavished upon them due to fashion or affectation? How far, in fact, did admiration for the orthodox tragedians take that place among the Athenians which going to church does among ourselves? This is a venturesome question considering the verdict now generally given for over 2,000 years, nor should I have permitted myself to ask it if it had not been suggested to me by one whose reputation stands as high, and has been sanctioned for as long time as those of the tragedians themselves, I mean by Aristophanes. Numbers, weight of authority, and time, have conspired to place Aristophanes on as high a literary pinnacle as any ancient writer, with the exception perhaps of Homer, but he makes no secret of heartily hating Euripides and Sophocles, and I strongly suspect only praises Aeschylus that he may run down the other two with greater impunity. For after all there is no such difference between Aeschylus and his successors as will render the former very good and the latter very bad, and the thrusts at Aeschylus which Aristophanes puts into the mouth of Euripides go home too well to have been written by an admirer. It may be observed that while Euripides accuses Aeschylus of being palm bundle-worded, which I suppose means bombastic and given to rhodomontade, Aeschylus retorts on Euripides that he is a gossip gleaner, a describer of beggars, and a rag stitcher, from which it may be inferred that he was truer to the life of his own times than Aeschylus was. It happens, however, that a faithful rendering of contemporary life is the very quality which gives its most permanent interest to any work of fiction, whether in literature or painting, and it is a not unnatural consequence that while only 7 plays by Aeschylus, and the same number by Sophocles, have come down to us, we have no fewer than 19 by Euripides. This, however, is a digression. The question before us is whether Aristophanes really liked Aeschylus or only pretended to do so. It must be remembered that the claims of Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, to the foremost place amongst tragedians were held to be as incontrovertible as those of Dante, Petrarch, Tasso and Ariosto to be the greatest of Italian poets, are held among the Italians of today. If we can fancy some witty, genial writer, we will say in Florence, finding himself bored by all the poets I have named, we can yet believe he would be unwilling to admit that he disliked them without exception. He would prefer to think he could see something at any rate in Dante, whom he could idealize more easily, inasmuch as he was more remote. In order to carry his countrymen the farther with him, he would endeavor to meet them more than was consistent with his own instincts. Without some such palliation as admiration for one, at any rate, of the tragedians, It would be almost as dangerous for Aristophanes to attack them as it would be for an Englishman now to say that he did not think very much of the Elizabethan dramatists. Yet which of us in his heart likes any of the Elizabethan dramatists except Shakespeare? Are they in reality anything else than literary struldbrugs? I conclude upon the whole that Aristophanes did not like any of the tragedians, yet no one will deny that this keen, witty, outspoken writer was as good a judge of literary value, and as able to see any beauties that the tragic dramas contained as 9/10ths, at any rate, of ourselves. He had, moreover, the advantage of thoroughly understanding the standpoint from which the tragedians expected their work to be judged, and what was his conclusion? Briefly, it was little else than this, that they were a fraud or something very like it. For my own part, I cordially agree with him. I am free to confess that with the exception perhaps of some of the Psalms of David I know no writings which seem so little to deserve their reputation. I do not know that I should particularly mind my sisters reading them, but I will take good care never to read them myself. This last bit about the Psalms was awful, and there was a great fight with the editor as to whether or no it should be allowed to stand. Ernest himself was frightened at it, but he had once heard someone say that the Psalms were many of them very poor, and on looking at them more closely, after he had been told this, he found that there could hardly be two opinions on the subject. So he caught up the remark and reproduced it as his own, concluding that these Psalms had probably never been written by David at all, but had got in among the others by mistake. The essay, perhaps on account of the passage about the Psalms, created quite a sensation, and on the whole was well received. Ernest's friends praised it more highly than it deserved, and he was himself very proud of it, but he dared not show it at Battersby. He knew also that he was now at the end of his tether. This was his one idea. I feel sure he had caught more than half of it from other people, and now he had not another thing left to write about. He found himself cursed with a small reputation which seemed to him much bigger than it was, and a consciousness that he could never keep it up. Before many days were over he felt his unfortunate essay to be a white elephant to him, which he must feed by hurrying into all sorts of frantic attempts to cap his triumph, and, as may be imagined, these attempts were failures. He did not understand that if he waited and listened and observed, another idea of some kind would probably occur to him some day, and that the development of this would in its turn suggest still further ones. He did not yet know that the very worst way of getting hold of ideas is to go hunting expressly after them. The way to get them is to study something of which one is fond, and to note down whatever crosses one's mind in reference to it, either during study or relaxation, in a little notebook kept always in the waistcoat pocket. Ernest has come to know all about this now, but it took him a long time to find it out, for this is not the kind of thing that is taught at schools and universities. Nor yet did he know that ideas, no less than the living beings in whose minds they arise, must be begotten by parents not very unlike themselves, the most original still differing but slightly from the parents that have given rise to them. Life is like a fugue, everything must grow out of the subject and there must be nothing new. Nor, again, did he see how hard it is to say where one idea ends and another begins, nor yet how closely this is paralleled in the difficulty of saying where a life begins or ends, or an action or indeed anything, there being an unity in spite of infinite multitude, and an infinite multitude in spite of unity. He thought that ideas came into clever people's heads by a kind of spontaneous germination, without parentage in the thoughts of others or the course of observation, for as yet he believed in genius, of which he well knew that he had none, if it was the fine frenzied thing he thought it was. Not very long before this he had come of age, and Theobald had handed him over his money, which amounted now to £5,000. It was invested to bring in £5 per cent and gave him therefore an income of £250 a year. He did not, however, realize the fact, he could realize nothing so foreign to his experience, that he was independent of his father till a long time afterwards, nor did Theobald make any difference in his manner towards him. So strong was the hold which habit and association held over both father and son, that the one considered he had as good a right as ever to dictate, and the other that he had as little right as ever to gainsay. During his last year at Cambridge he overworked himself through this very blind deference to his father's wishes, for there was no reason why he should take more than a full degree except that his father laid such stress upon his taking honours. He became so ill, indeed, that it was doubtful how far he would be able to go in for his degree at all, but he managed to do so, and when the list came out was found to be placed higher than either he or anyone else expected, being among the first 3 or 4 senior optimes, and a few weeks later, in the lower half of the second class of the classical tripos. Ill as he was when he got home, Theobald made him go over all the examination papers with him, and in fact reproduce as nearly as possible the replies that he had sent in. So little kick had he in him, and so deep was the groove into which he had got, that while at home he spent several hours a day in continuing his classical and mathematical studies as though he had not yet taken his degree. Chapter 47. Ernest returned to Cambridge for the May term of 1858, on the plea of reading for ordination, with which he was now face to face, and much nearer than he liked. Up to this time, though not religiously inclined, he had never doubted the truth of anything that had been told him about Christianity. He had never seen anyone who doubted, nor read anything that raised a suspicion in his mind as to the historical character of the miracles recorded in the Old and New Testaments. It must be remembered that the year 1858 was the last of a term during which the peace of the Church of England was singularly unbroken. Between 1844, when Vestiges of Creation appeared, and 1859, when Essays and Reviews marked the commencement of that storm which raged until many years afterwards, there was not a single book published in England that caused serious commotion within the bosom of the Church. Perhaps Buckle's History of Civilization and Mill's Liberty were the most alarming, but they neither of them reached the substratum of the reading public, and Ernest and his friends were ignorant of their very existence. The evangelical movement, with the exception to which I shall revert presently, had become almost a matter of ancient history. Tractarianism had subsided into a 10th day's wonder, it was at work, but it was not noisy. The Vestiges were forgotten before Ernest went up to Cambridge, the Catholic aggression scare had lost its terrors, ritualism was still unknown by the general provincial public, and the Gorham and Hampton controversies were defunct some years since, dissent was not spreading, the Crimean War was the one engrossing subject, to be followed by the Indian Mutiny and the Franco-Austrian War. These great events turned men's minds from speculative subjects, and there was no enemy to the faith which could arouse even a languid interest. At no time probably since the beginning of the century could an ordinary observer have detected less sign of coming disturbance than at that of which I am writing. I need hardly say that the calm was only on the surface. Older men, who knew more than undergraduates were likely to do, must have seen that the wave of skepticism which had already broken over Germany was setting towards our own shores, nor was it long, indeed, before it reached them. Ernest had hardly been ordained before 3 works in quick succession arrested the attention even of those who paid least heed to theological controversy. I mean Essays and Reviews, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, and Bishop Colenso's criticisms on the Pentateuch. This, however, is a digression. I must revert to the one phase of spiritual activity which had any life in it during the time Ernest was at Cambridge, that is to say, to the remains of the evangelical awakening of more than a generation earlier, which was connected with the name of Simeon. There were still a good many Simeonites, or as they were more briefly called Sims, in Ernest's time. Every college contained some of them, but their headquarters were at Caius, whither they were attracted by Mr. Clayton, who was at that time senior tutor, and among the Cesars of St. John's. Behind the then chapel of this last named college, there was a labyrinth, this was the name it bore, of dingy, tumble-down rooms, tenanted exclusively by the poorest undergraduates, who were dependent upon Cesarships and scholarships for the means of taking their degrees. To many, even at St. John's, The existence and whereabouts of the labyrinth in which the Caesars chiefly lived was unknown. Some men in Ernest's time, who had rooms in the first court, had never found their way through the sinuous passage which led to it. In the labyrinth there dwelt men of all ages, from mere lads to grey-haired old men who had entered late in life. They were rarely seen except in hall or chapel or at lecture, where their manners of feeding, praying and studying, were considered alike objectionable. No one knew whence they came, whither they went, nor what they did, for they never showed at cricket or the boats. They were a gloomy, seedy-looking confrery, who had as little to glory in clothes and manners as in the flesh itself. Ernest and his friends used to consider themselves marvels of economy for getting on with so little money, but the greater number of dwellers in the labyrinth would have considered one half of their expenditure to be an exceeding measure of affluence, and so doubtless any domestic tyranny which had been experienced by Ernest was a small thing to what the average Johnnian Caesar had had to put up with. A few would at once emerge on its being found after their first examination that they were likely to be ornaments to the college. These would win valuable scholarships that enabled them to live in some degree of comfort, and would amalgamate with the more studious of those who were in a better social position, but even these, with few exceptions, were long in shaking off the uncouthness they brought with them to the university, nor would their origin cease to be easily recognizable till they had become dons and tutors. I have seen some of these men attain high position in the world of politics or science, and yet still retain a look of labyrinth and Johnnian Caesarship. Unprepossessing then, in feature, gait and manners, unkempt and ill-dressed beyond what can be easily described, these poor fellows formed a class apart, whose thoughts and ways were not as the thoughts and ways of Ernest and his friends, and it was among them that Simeonism chiefly flourished. Destined most of them for the church, for in those days holy orders were seldom heard of, the Simeonites held themselves to have received a very loud call to the ministry, and were ready to pinch themselves for years so as to prepare for it by the necessary theological courses. To most of them the fact of becoming clergymen would be the entree into a social position from which they were at present kept out by barriers they well knew to be impassable. Ordination, therefore, opened fields for ambition which made it the central point in their thoughts, rather than as with Ernest, something which he supposed would have to be done some day, but about which, as about dying, he hoped there was no need to trouble himself as yet. By way of preparing themselves more completely they would have meetings in one another's rooms for tea and prayer and other spiritual exercises. Placing themselves under the guidance of a few well-known tutors they would teach in Sunday schools, and be instant, in season and out of season, in imparting spiritual instruction to all whom they could persuade to listen to them. But the soil of the more prosperous undergraduates was not suitable for the seed they tried to sow. The small pieties with which they larded their discourse, if chance threw them into the company of one whom they considered worldly, caused nothing but aversion in the minds of those for whom they were intended. When they distributed tracts, dropping them by night into good men's letter-boxes while they were asleep, their tracts got burned, or met with even worse contumely. They were themselves also treated with a ridicule which they reflected proudly had been the lot of true followers of Christ in all ages. Often at their prayer meetings was the passage of St. Paul referred to in which he bids his Corinthian converts note concerning themselves that they were for the most part neither well-bred nor intellectual people. They reflected with pride that they too had nothing to be proud of in these respects, and like St. Paul, gloried in the fact that in the flesh they had not much to glory. Ernest had several Johnnian friends, and came thus to hear about the Simeonites and to see some of them, who were pointed out to him as they passed through the courts. They had a repellent attraction for him, he disliked them, but he could not bring himself to leave them alone. On one occasion he had gone so far as to parody one of the tracts they had sent round in the night, and to get a copy dropped into each of the leading Simeonites' boxes. The subject he had taken was personal cleanliness. Cleanliness, he said, was next to godliness. He wished to know on which side it was to stand, and concluded by exhorting Simeonites to a freer use of the tub. I cannot commend my hero's humor in this matter. His tract was not brilliant, but I mention the fact as showing that at this time he was something of a Saul and took pleasure in persecuting the elect, not, as I have said, that he had any hankering after skepticism, but because, like the farmers in his father's village, though he would not stand seeing the Christian religion made light of, he was not going to see it taken seriously. Ernest's friends thought his dislike for Simeonites was due to his being the son of a clergyman who, it was known, bullied him. It is more likely, however, that it rose from an unconscious sympathy with them, which, as in St. Paul's case, in the end drew him into the ranks of those whom he had most despised and hated. Chapter 48. Once, recently, when he was down at home after taking his degree, his mother had had a short conversation with him about his becoming a clergyman, set on thereto by Theobald, who shrank from the subject himself. This time it was during a turn taken in the garden, and not on the sofa, which was reserved for supreme occasions. "You know, my dearest boy," she said to him, "that Papa," she always called Theobald Papa when talking to Ernest, "is so anxious you should not go into the church blindly, and without fully realizing the difficulties of a clergyman's position. He has considered all of them himself, and has been shown how small they are, when they are faced boldly. But he wishes you, too, to feel them as strongly and completely as possible before committing yourself to irrevocable vows, so that you may never, never have to regret the step you will have taken." This was the first time Ernest had heard that there were any difficulties, and he not unnaturally inquired in a vague way after their nature. "That, my dear boy," rejoined Christina, "is a question which I am not fitted to enter upon either by nature or education. I might easily unsettle your mind without being able to settle it again. Oh, no. Such questions are far better avoided by women, and, I should have thought, by men, but Papa wished me to speak to you upon the subject, so that there might be no mistake hereafter, and I have done so. Now, therefore, you know all." The conversation ended here, so far as this subject was concerned, and Ernest thought he did know all. His mother would not have told him he knew all, not about a matter of that sort, unless he actually did know it. Well, it did not come to very much. He supposed there were some difficulties, but his father, who at any rate was an excellent scholar and a learned man, was probably quite right here, and he need not trouble himself more about them. So little impression did the conversation make on him, that it was not till long afterwards that, happening to remember it, he saw what a piece of sleight of hand had been practiced upon him. Theobald and Christina, however, were satisfied that they had done their duty by opening their son's eyes to the difficulties of assenting to all a clergyman must assent to. This was enough. It was a matter for rejoicing that, though they had been put so fully and candidly before him, he did not find them serious. It was not in vain that they had prayed for so many years to be made truly honest and conscientious. Now, my dear," resumed Christina, after having disposed of all the difficulties that might stand in the way of Ernest's becoming a clergyman, "there is another matter on which I should like to have a talk with you. It is about your sister Charlotte. You know how clever she is, and what a dear, kind sister she has been and always will be to yourself and Joey. I wish, my dearest Ernest, that I saw more chance of her finding a suitable husband than I do at Battersby, and I sometimes think you might do more than you do to help her." Ernest began to chafe at this, for he had heard it so often, but he said nothing. "You know, my dear, a brother can do so much for his sister if he lays himself out to do it. A mother can do very little. Indeed, it is hardly a mother's place to seek out young men. It is a brother's place to find a suitable partner for his sister. All that I can do is to try to make Battersby as attractive as possible to any of your friends whom you may invite. And in that," she added, with a little toss of her head, "I do not think I have been deficient hitherto." Ernest said he had already at different times asked several of his friends. "Yes, my dear, but you must admit that they were none of them exactly the kind of young man whom Charlotte could be expected to take a fancy to. Indeed, I must own to having been a little disappointed that you should have yourself chosen any of these as your intimate friends." Ernest winced again. "You never brought down Figgins when you were at Rubborough," Now I should have thought Figgins would have been just the kind of boy whom you might have asked to come and see us." Figgins had been gone through times out of number already. Ernest had hardly known him, and Figgins, being nearly 3 years older than Ernest, had left long before he did. Besides, he had not been a nice boy, and had made himself unpleasant to Ernest in many ways. "Now," continued his mother, "there's Towneley. I have heard you speak of Towneley as having rowed with you in a boat at Cambridge. I wish, my dear, you would cultivate your acquaintance with Towneley, and ask him to pay us a visit. The name has an aristocratic sound, and I think I have heard you say he is an eldest son." Ernest flushed at the sound of Towneley's name. What had really happened in respect of Ernest's friends was briefly this. His mother liked to get hold of the names of the boys, and especially of any who were at all intimate with her son. The more she heard, the more she wanted to know. There was no gorging her to satiety. She was like a ravenous young cuckoo being fed upon a grass plot by a water wagtail. She would swallow all that Ernest could bring her, and yet be as hungry as before. And she always went to Ernest for her meals rather than to Joey, for Joey was either more stupid or more impenetrable. At any rate, she could pump Ernest much the better of the two. From time to time an actual live boy had been thrown to her, either by being caught and brought to Battersby, or by being asked to meet her if at any time she came to Rubborough. She had generally made herself agreeable, or fairly agreeable, as long as the boy was present, but as soon as she got Ernest to herself again she changed her note. Into whatever form she might throw her criticisms, it came always in the end to this, that his friend was no good, that Ernest was not much better, and that he should have brought her someone else, for this one would not do at all. The more intimate the boy had been or was supposed to be with Ernest, the more he was declared to be not, till in the end he had hit upon the plan of saying, concerning any boy whom he particularly liked, that he was not one of his especial chums, and that indeed he hardly knew why he had asked him, but he found he only fell on Scylla in trying to avoid Charybdis, for though the boy was declared to be more successful, it was Ernest who was not for not thinking more highly of him. When she had once got hold of a name she never forgot it. "And how is so-and-so?" she would exclaim, mentioning some former friend of Ernest's with whom he had either now quarreled, or who had long since proved to be a mere comet and no fixed star at all. How Ernest wished he had never mentioned so-and-so's name, and vowed to himself that he would never talk about his friends in future, but in a few hours he would forget and would prattle away as imprudently as ever. Then his mother would pounce noiselessly on his remarks as a barnacle pounces upon a mouse, and would bring them up in a pellet 6 months afterwards when they were no longer in harmony with their surroundings. Then there was Theobald. If a boy or college friend had been invited to Battersby, Theobald would lay himself out at first to be agreeable. He could do this well enough when he liked, and as regards the outside world he generally did like. His clerical neighbors, and indeed all his neighbors, respected him yearly more and more, and would have given Ernest sufficient cause to regret his imprudence if he had dared to hint that he had anything, however little, to complain of. Theobald's mind worked in this way. "Now, I know Ernest has told this boy what a disagreeable person I am, and I will just show him that I am not disagreeable at all, but a good old fellow, a jolly old boy, in fact a regular old brick, and that it is Ernest who is in fault all through." So he would behave very nicely to the boy at first, and the boy would be delighted with him, and side with him against Ernest. Of course, if Ernest had got the boy to come to Battersby, he wanted him to enjoy his visit, and was therefore pleased that Theobald should behave so well, but at the same time he stood so much in need of moral support that it was painful to him to see one of his own familiar friends go over to the enemy's camp. For no matter how well we may know a thing, how clearly we may see a certain patch of color, for example, as red, it shakes us and knocks us about to find another see it, or be more than half inclined to see it, as green. Theobald had generally begun to get a little impatient before the end of the visit, but the impression formed during the earlier part was the one which the visitor had carried away with him. Theobald never discussed any of the boys with Ernest. It was Christina who did this. Theobald let them come, because Christina in a quiet, persistent way insisted on it. When they did come he behaved, as I have said, civilly, but he did not like it. Whereas Christina did like it very much. She would have had half Rubborough and half Cambridge to come and stay at Battersby if she could have managed it, and if it would not have cost so much money. She liked their coming, so that she might make a new acquaintance, and she liked tearing them to pieces and flinging the bits over Ernest as soon as she had had enough of them. The worst of it was that she had so often proved to be right. Boys and young men are violent in their affections, but they are seldom very constant. It is not till they get older that they really know the kind of friend they want. In their earlier essays, young men are simply learning to judge character. Ernest had been no exception to the general rule. His swans had one after the other proved to be more or less geese even in his own estimation, and he was beginning almost to think that his mother was a better judge of character than he was. But I think it may be assumed with some certainty that if Ernest had brought her a real young swan she would have declared it to be the ugliest and worst goose of all that she had yet seen. At first he had not suspected that his friends were wanted with a view to Charlotte. It was understood that Charlotte and they might perhaps take a fancy for one another, and that would be so very nice, would it not? But he did not see that there was any deliberate malice in the arrangement. Now, however, that he had awoke to what it all meant, he was less inclined to bring any friend of his to Battersby. It seemed to his silly young mind almost dishonest to ask your friend to come and see you when all you really meant was please, marry my sister. It was like trying to obtain money under false pretenses. If he had been fond of Charlotte it might have been another matter, but he thought her one of the most disagreeable young women in the whole circle of his acquaintance. She was supposed to be very clever. All young ladies are either very pretty or very clever or very sweet. They may take their choice as to which category they will go in for, but go in for one of the three they must. It was hopeless to try and pass Charlotte off as either pretty or sweet. So she became clever as the only remaining alternative. Ernest never knew what particular branch of study it was in which she showed her talent, for she could neither play nor sing nor draw. But so astute are women that his mother and Charlotte really did persuade him into thinking that she, Charlotte, had something more akin to true genius than any other member of the family. Not one, however, of all the friends whom Ernest had been inveigled into trying to inveigle had shown the least sign of being so far struck with Charlotte's commanding powers, as to wish to make them his own. And this may have had something to do with the rapidity and completeness with which Christina had dismissed them one after another and had wanted a new one. And now she wanted Towneley. Ernest had seen this coming and had tried to avoid it, for he knew how impossible it was for him to ask Towneley, even if he had wished to do so. Towneley belonged to one of the most exclusive sets in Cambridge, and was perhaps the most popular man among the whole number of undergraduates. He was big and very handsome, as it seemed to Ernest the handsomest man whom he ever had seen or ever could see, for it was impossible to imagine a more lively and agreeable countenance. He was good at cricket and boating, very good-natured, singularly free from conceit, not clever but very sensible, and, lastly, his father and mother had been drowned by the overturning of a boat when he was only 2 years old and had left him as their only child and heir to one of the finest estates in the south of England. Fortune every now and then does things handsomely by a man all round. Towneley was one of those to whom she had taken a fancy, and the universal verdict in this case was that she had chosen wisely. Ernest had seen Towneley as everyone else in the university, except, of course, Dons, had seen him, for he was a man of mark, and being very susceptible he had liked Towneley even more than most people did, but at the same time it never so much as entered his head that he should come to know him. He liked looking at him if he got a chance, and was very much ashamed of himself for doing so, but there the matter ended. By a strange accident, however, during Ernest's last year, when the names of the crews for the Scratchfors were drawn he had found himself coxswain of a crew, among whom was none other than his especial hero Towneley. The 3 others were ordinary mortals, but they could row fairly well, and the crew on the whole was rather a good one. Ernest was frightened out of his wits. When, however, the two met, he found Towneley no less remarkable for his entire want of anything like side, and for his power of setting those whom he came across at their ease, than he was for outward accomplishments. The only difference he found between Towneley and other people was that he was so very much easier to get on with. Of course Ernest worshipped him more and more. The Scratchfors being ended, the connection between the two came to an end, but Towneley never passed Ernest thenceforward without a nod and a few good-natured words. In an evil moment he had mentioned Towneley's name at Battersby, and now what was the result? Here was his mother plaguing him to ask Towneley to come down to Battersby and marry Charlotte. Why, if he had thought there was the remotest chance of Towneley's marrying Charlotte, he would have gone down on his knees to him and told him what an odious young woman she was, and implored him to save himself while there was yet time. But Ernest had not prayed to be made truly honest and conscientious for as many years as Christina had. He tried to conceal what he felt and thought as well as he could, and led the conversation back to the difficulties which a clergyman might feel to stand in the way of his being ordained, not because he had any misgivings, but as a diversion. His mother, however, thought she had settled all that, and he got no more out of her. Soon afterwards he found the means of escaping, and was not slow to avail himself of them. Chapter 49. On his return to Cambridge in the May term of 1858, Ernest and a few other friends who were also intended for orders came to the conclusion that they must now take a more serious view of their position. They therefore attended chapel more regularly than hitherto, and held evening meetings of a somewhat furtive character, at which they would study the New Testament. They even began to commit the epistles of St. Paul to memory in the original Greek. They got up Beveridge on the 39 Articles, and Pearson on the Creed. In their hours of recreation they read More's Mystery of Godliness, which Ernest thought was charming, and Taylor's Holy Living and Dying, which also impressed him deeply, through what he thought was the splendor of its language. They handed themselves over to the guidance of Dean Alford's notes on the Greek Testament, which made Ernest better understand what was meant by difficulties, but also made him feel how shallow and impotent were the conclusions arrived at by German neologians, with whose works, being innocent of German, he was not otherwise acquainted. Some of the friends who joined him in these pursuits were Johnians, and the meetings were often held within the walls of St. John's. I do not know how tidings of these furtive gatherings had reached the Simeonites, but they must have come round to them in some way, for they had not been continued many weeks before a circular was sent to each of the young men who attended them, informing them that the Reverend Gideon Hawke, a well-known London evangelical preacher, whose sermons were then much talked of, was about to visit his young friend Badcock of St. John's, and would be glad to say a few words to any who might wish to hear them, in Badcock's rooms on a certain evening in May. Badcock was one of the most notorious of all the Simeonites. Not only was he ugly, dirty, ill-dressed, bumptious, and in every way objectionable, but he was deformed and waddled when he walked, so that he had won a nickname which I can only reproduce by calling it "Here's my back, and there's my back," because the lower parts of his back emphasized themselves demonstratively as though about to fly off in different directions like the two extreme notes in the chord of the augmented sixth, with every step he took. It may be guessed, therefore, that the receipt of the circular had for a moment an almost paralyzing effect on those to whom it was addressed, owing to the astonishment which it occasioned them. It certainly was a daring surprise, but like so many deformed people, Badcock was forward and hard to check. He was a pushing fellow to whom the present was just the opportunity he wanted for carrying war into the enemy's quarters. Ernest and his friends consulted. Moved by the feeling that as they were now preparing to be clergymen they ought not to stand so stiffly on social dignity as heretofore, and also perhaps by the desire to have a good private view of a preacher who was then much upon the lips of men, they decided to accept the invitation. When the appointed time came they went with some confusion and self-abasement to the rooms of this man, on whom they had looked down hitherto as from an immeasurable height, and with whom nothing would have made them believe a few weeks earlier that they could ever come to be on speaking terms. Mr. Hawke was a very different-looking person from Badcock. He was remarkably handsome, or rather would have been but for the thinness of his lips, and a look of too great firmness and inflexibility. His features were a good deal like those of Leonardo da Vinci, moreover he was kempt, looked in vigorous health, and was of a ruddy countenance. He was extremely courteous in his manner, and paid a good deal of attention to Badcock, of whom he seemed to think highly. Altogether our young friends were taken aback, and inclined to think smaller beer of themselves and larger of Badcock than was agreeable to the old Adam who was still alive within them. A few well-known Sims from St. John's and other colleges were present, but not enough to swamp the earnest set, as for the sake of brevity, I will call them. After a preliminary conversation in which there was nothing to offend, the business of the evening began by Mr. Hawks standing up at one end of the table, and saying "Let us pray." The earnest set did not like this, but they could not help themselves, so they knelt down and repeated the Lord's Prayer and a few others after Mr. Hawk, who delivered them remarkably well. Then, when all had sat down, Mr. Hawk addressed them, speaking without notes and taking for his text the words, "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me?" Whether owing to Mr. Hawk's manner, which was impressive, or to his well-known reputation for ability, or whether from the fact that each one of the earnest set knew that he had been more or less a persecutor of the Sims and yet felt instinctively that the Sims were after all much more like the early Christians than he was himself, at any rate the text, familiar though it was, went home to the consciences of Ernest and his friends as it had never yet done. If Mr. Hawk had stopped here he would have almost said enough, as he scanned the faces turned towards him, and saw the impression he had made. He was perhaps minded to bring his sermon to an end before beginning it, but if so, he reconsidered himself and proceeded as follows: I give the sermon in full, for it is a typical one, and will explain a state of mind which in another generation or two will seem to stand sadly in need of explanation. My young friends, said Mr. Hawk, I am persuaded there is not one of you here who doubts the existence of a personal God. If there were, it is to him assuredly that I should first address myself. Should I be mistaken in my belief that all here assembled accept the existence of a God who is present amongst us though we see him not, and whose eye is upon our most secret thoughts, let me implore the doubter to confer with me in private before we part. I will then put before him considerations through which God has been mercifully pleased to reveal himself to me, so far as man can understand him, and which I have found bring peace to the minds of others who have doubted. I assume also that there is none who doubts but that this God, after whose likeness we have been made, did in the course of time have pity upon man's blindness, and assume our nature, taking flesh and coming down and dwelling among us as a man indistinguishable physically from ourselves. He who made the sun, moon and stars, the world and all that therein is, came down from heaven in the person of his Son, with the express purpose of leading a scorned life, and dying the most cruel, shameful death which fiendish ingenuity has invented. While on earth he worked many miracles. He gave sight to the blind, raised the dead to life, fed thousands with a few loaves and fishes, and was seen to walk upon the waves, but at the end of his appointed time he died, as was foredetermined, upon the cross, and was buried by a few faithful friends. Those, however, who had put him to death set a jealous watch over his tomb. There is no one, I feel sure, in this room who doubts any part of the foregoing, but if there is, let me again pray him to confer with me in private, and I doubt not that by the blessing of God his doubts will cease. The next day but one after our Lord was buried, the tomb being still jealously guarded by enemies, an angel was seen descending from heaven with glittering raiment and a countenance that shone like fire. This glorious being rolled away the stone from the grave, and our Lord himself came forth, risen from the dead. My young friends, this is no fanciful story like those of the ancient deities, but a matter of plain history as certain as that you and I are now here together. If there is one fact better vouched for than another in the whole range of certainties it is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, nor is it less well assured that a few weeks after he had risen from the dead, Our Lord was seen by many hundreds of men and women to rise amid a host of angels into the air upon a heavenward journey till the clouds covered him and concealed him from the sight of men. It may be said that the truth of these statements has been denied, but what, let me ask you, has become of the questioners? Where are they now? Do we see them or hear of them? Have they been able to hold what little ground they made during the supineness of the last century? Is there one of your fathers or mothers or friends who does not see through them? Is there a single teacher or a preacher in this great university who has not examined what these men had to say, and found it not? Did you ever meet one of them, or do you find any of their books securing the respectful attention of those competent to judge concerning them? I think not, and I think also you know as well as I do why it is that they have sunk back into the abyss from which they for a time emerged. It is because after the most careful and patient examination by the ablest and most judicial minds of many countries, their arguments were found so untenable that they themselves renounced them. They fled from the field routed, dismayed, and suing for peace, nor have they again come to the front in any civilized country. You know these things. Why, then, do I insist upon them? My dear young friends, your own consciousness will have made the answer to each one of you already. It is because, though you know so well that these things did verily and indeed happen, you know also that you have not realized them to yourselves as it was your duty to do, nor heeded their momentous, awful import. And now let me go further. You all know that you will one day come to die, or if not to die, for there are not wanting signs which make me hope that the Lord may come again, while some of us now present are alive, yet to be changed, for the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, for this corruption must put on incorruption, and this mortal put on immortality, and the saying shall be brought to pass that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Do you, or do you not believe that you will one day stand before the judgment seat of Christ? Do you, or do you not believe that you will have to give an account for every idle word that you have ever spoken? Do you, or do you not believe that you are called to live, not according to the will of man, but according to the will of that Christ who came down from heaven out of love for you, who suffered and died for you, who calls you to him, and yearns towards you that you may take heed even in this your day, but who, if you heed not, will also one day judge you, and with whom there is no variableness nor shadow of turning. My dear young friends, strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth to eternal life, and few there be that find it. Few, 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 for he who will not give up all for Christ's sake, has given up nothing. If you would live in the friendship of this world, if indeed you are not prepared to give up everything you most fondly cherish, should the Lord require it of you, then, I say, put the idea of Christ deliberately on one side at once. Spit upon him, buffet him, crucify him anew, do anything you like so long as you secure the friendship of this world while it is still in your power to do so. The pleasures of this brief life may not be worth paying for by the torments of eternity, but they are something while they last. If, on the other hand, you would live in the friendship of God, and be among the number of those for whom Christ has not died in vain, if, in a word, you value your eternal welfare, then give up the friendship of this world. Of a surety you must make your choice between God and mammon, for you cannot serve both. I put these considerations before you, if so homely a term may be pardoned, as a plain matter of business. There is nothing low or unworthy in this, as some lately have pretended, for all nature shows us that there is nothing more acceptable to God than an enlightened view of our own self-interest. Never let anyone delude you here. It is a simple question of fact. Did certain things happen or did they not? If they did happen, is it reasonable to suppose that you will make yourselves and others more happy by one course of conduct or by another? And now let me ask you what answer you have made to this question hitherto? Whose friendship have you chosen? If, knowing what you know, you have not yet begun to act according to the immensity of the knowledge that is in you, then he who builds his house and lays up his treasure on the edge of a crater of molten lava is a sane, sensible person in comparison with yourselves? I say this as no figure of speech or bugbear with which to frighten you, but as an unvarnished, unexaggerated statement which will be no more disputed by yourselves than by me. And now Mr. Hawke, who up to this time had spoken with singular quietness, changed his manner to one of greater warmth and continued, "Oh, my young friends, turn, now while it is called today, now from this hour, from this instant, stay not even to gird up your loins, look not behind you for a second, but fly into the bosom of that Christ who is to be found of all who seek him, and from that fearful wrath of God which lieth in wait for those who know not the things belonging to their peace. For the Son of Man cometh as a thief in the night, and there is not one of us can tell but what this day his soul may be required of him. If there is even one here who has heeded me, and he let his eye fall for an instant upon almost all his hearers, but especially on the earnest set, I shall know that it was not for nothing that I felt the call of the Lord, and heard as I thought a voice by night that bade me come hither quickly, for there was a chosen vessel who had need of me." Here Mr. Hawke ended rather abruptly. His earnest manner, striking countenance and excellent delivery had produced an effect greater than the actual words I have given can convey to the reader. The virtue lay in the man more than in what he said. As for the last few mysterious words about his having heard a voice by night, their effect was magical. There was not one who did not look down to the ground, nor who in his heart did not half believe that he was the chosen vessel on whose especial behalf God had sent Mr. Hawke to Cambridge. Even if this were not so, each one of them felt that he was now for the first time in the actual presence of one who had had a direct communication from the Almighty, and they were thus suddenly brought 100-fold nearer to the New Testament miracles. They were amazed, not to say scared, and as though by tacit consent they gathered together, thanked Mr. Hawke for his sermon, said good night in a humble deferential manner to Badcock and the other Simeonites, and left the room together. They had heard nothing but what they had been hearing all their lives. How was it, then, that they were so dumbfoundered by it? I suppose partly because they had lately begun to think more seriously, and were in a fit state to be impressed, partly from the greater directness with which each felt himself addressed, through the sermon being delivered in a room, and partly to the logical consistency, freedom from exaggeration, and profound air of conviction with which Mr. Hawke had spoken. His simplicity and obvious earnestness had impressed them even before he had alluded to his special mission, but this clenched everything, and the words "Lord, is it I?" were upon the hearts of each as they walked pensively home through moonlit courts and cloisters. I do not know what passed among the Simeonites after the earnest set had left them, but they would have been more than mortal if they had not been a good deal elated with the results of the evening. Why, one of Ernest's friends was in the University 11, and he had actually been in Badcock's rooms and had slunk off on saying good night as meekly as any of them. It was no small thing to have scored a success like this. Chapter 50. Ernest felt now that the turning point of his life had come. He would give up all for Christ, even his tobacco. So he gathered together his pipes and pouches, and locked them up in his portmanteau under his bed where they should be out of sight, and as much out of mind as possible. He did not burn them, because someone might come in who wanted to smoke, and though he might abridge his own liberty, yet, as smoking was not a sin, there was no reason why he should be hard on other people. After breakfast he left his rooms to call on a man named Dawson, who had been one of Mr. Hawke's hearers on the preceding evening, and who was reading for ordination at the forthcoming Ember Weeks, now only 4 months distant. This man had been always of a rather serious turn of mind, a little too much so for Ernest's taste, but times had changed, and Dawson's undoubted sincerity seemed to render him a fitting counselor for Ernest at the present time. As he was going through the first court of John's on his way to Dawson's rooms, he met Badcock, and greeted him with some deference. His advance was received with one of those ecstatic gleams which shone occasionally upon the face of Badcock, and which, if Ernest had known more, would have reminded him of Robespierre. As it was, he saw it and unconsciously recognized the unrest and self-seekingness of the man, but could not yet formulate them. He disliked Badcock more than ever, but as he was going to profit by the spiritual benefits which he had put in his way, he was bound to be civil to him, and civil he therefore was. Badcock told him that Mr. Hawke had returned to town immediately his discourse was over, but that before doing so he had inquired particularly who Ernest and 2 or 3 others were. I believe each one of Ernest's friends was given to understand that he had been more or less particularly inquired after. Ernest's vanity, for he was his mother's son, was tickled at this. The idea again presented itself to him that he might be the one for whose benefit Mr. Hawke had been sent. There was something, too, in Badcock's manner which conveyed the idea that he could say more if he chose, but had been enjoined to silence. On reaching Dawson's rooms, he found his friend in raptures over the discourse of the preceding evening. Hardly less delighted was he with the effect it had produced on Ernest. He had always known, he said, that Ernest would come round, he had been sure of it, but he had hardly expected the conversion to be so sudden. Ernest said no more had he, but now that he saw his duty so clearly he would get ordained as soon as possible, and take a curacy, even though the doing so would make him have to go down from Cambridge earlier, which would be a great grief to him. Dawson applauded this determination, and it was arranged that as Ernest was still more or less of a weak brother, Dawson should take him, so to speak, in spiritual tow for a while, and strengthen and confirm his faith. An offensive and defensive alliance therefore was struck up between this pair, who were in reality singularly ill-assorted, and Ernest set to work to master the books on which the bishop would examine him. Others gradually joined them till they formed a small set or church, for these are the same things, and the effect of Mr. Hawke's sermon, instead of wearing off in a few days, as might have been expected, became more and more marked, so much so that it was necessary for Ernest's friends to hold him back rather than urge him on, for he seemed likely to develop, as indeed he did for a time, into a religious enthusiast. In one matter only, did he openly backslide. He had, as I said above, locked up his pipes and tobacco, so that he might not be tempted to use them. All day long on the day after Mr. Hawke's sermon he let them lie in his portmanteau bravely, but this was not very difficult, as he had for some time given up smoking till after Hall. After Hall this day he did not smoke till chapel time, and then went to chapel in self-defense. When he returned he determined to look at the matter from a common-sense point of view. On this he saw that, provided tobacco did not injure his health, and he really could not see that it did, it stood much on the same footing as tea or coffee. Tobacco had nowhere been forbidden in the Bible, but then it had not yet been discovered, and had probably only escaped prescription for this reason. We can conceive of St. Paul or even our Lord himself as drinking a cup of tea, but we cannot imagine either of them as smoking a cigarette or a churchwarden. Ernest could not deny this, and admitted that Paul would almost certainly have condemned tobacco in good round terms if he had known of its existence. Was it not then taking rather a mean advantage of the apostle to stand on his not having actually forbidden it? On the other hand, it was possible that God knew Paul would have forbidden smoking, and had purposely arranged the discovery of tobacco for a period at which Paul should be no longer living. This might seem rather hard on Paul, considering all he had done for Christianity, but it would be made up to him in other ways. These reflections satisfied Ernest that on the whole he had better smoke, so he sneaked to his portmanteau and brought out his pipes and tobacco again. There should be moderation he felt in all things, even in virtue, so for that night he smoked immoderately. It was a pity, however, that he had bragged to Dawson about giving up smoking. The pipes had better be kept in a cupboard for a week or two, till in other and easier respects Ernest should have proved his steadfastness. Then they might steal out again little by little, and so they did. Ernest now wrote home a letter couched in a vein different from his ordinary ones. His letters were usually all common form and padding, for as I have already explained, if he wrote about anything that really interested him, his mother always wanted to know more and more about it, every fresh answer being as the lopping off of a hydra's head and giving birth to half a dozen or more new questions, but in the end it came invariably to the same result, namely, that he ought to have done something else, or ought not to go on doing as he proposed. Now, however, there was a new departure, and for the 1000th time he concluded that he was about to take a course of which his father and mother would approve, and in which they would be interested, so that at last he and they might get on more sympathetically than heretofore. He therefore wrote a gushing impulsive letter, which afforded much amusement to myself as I read it, but which is too long for reproduction. One passage ran, "I am now going towards Christ, the greater number of my college friends are, I fear, going away from him. We must pray for them that they may find the peace that is in Christ even as I have myself found it." Ernest covered his face with his hands for shame as he read this extract from the bundle of letters he had put into my hands. They had been returned to him by his father on his mother's death, his mother having carefully preserved them. "Shall I cut it out?" said I. "I will if you like." "Certainly not," he answered, "and if good-natured friends have kept more records of my follies, pick out any plums that may amuse the reader, and let him have his laugh over them. But fancy what effect a letter like this, so unled up to, must have produced at Battersby." Even Christina refrained from ecstasy over her son's having discovered the power of Christ's word, while Theobald was frightened out of his wits. It was well his son was not going to have any doubts or difficulties, and that he would be ordained without making a fuss over it, but he smelt mischief in this sudden conversion of one who had never yet shown any inclination towards religion. He hated people who did not know where to stop. Ernest was always so outré and strange, there was never any knowing what he would do next, except that it would be something unusual and silly. If he was to get the bit between his teeth after he had got ordained and bought his living, he would play more pranks than ever he, Theobald, had done. The fact, doubtless, of his being ordained and having bought a living would go a long way to steady him, and if he married, his wife must see to the rest. This was his only chance and, to do justice to his sagacity, Theobald in his heart did not think very highly of it. When Ernest came down to Battersby in June, he imprudently tried to open up a more unreserved communication with his father than was his wont. The first of Ernest's snipe-like flights on being flushed by Mr. Hawke's sermon was in the direction of ultra-evangelicalism. Theobald himself had been much more low than High Church. This was the normal development of the country clergyman during the first years of his clerical life, between, we will say, the years 1825 to 1850, but he was not prepared for the almost contempt with which Ernest now regarded the doctrines of baptismal regeneration and priestly absolution. Hoity-toity, indeed, what business had he with such questions? Nor for his desire to find some means of reconciling Methodism and the Church. Theobald hated the Church of Rome, but he hated dissenters too, for he found them as a general rule troublesome people to deal with. He always found people who did not agree with him troublesome to deal with. Besides, they set up for knowing as much as he did. Nevertheless, if he had been let alone he would have leaned towards them rather than towards the High Church party. The neighboring clergy, however, would not let him alone. One by one they had come under the influence, directly or indirectly, of the Oxford movement which had begun 20 years earlier. It was surprising how many practices he now tolerated which in his youth he would have considered popish. He knew very well therefore which way things were going in church matters, and saw that as usual Ernest was setting himself the other way. The opportunity for telling his son that he was a fool was too favorable not to be embraced, and Theobald was not slow to embrace it. Ernest was annoyed and surprised, for had not his father and mother been wanting him to be more religious all his life? Now that he had become so they were still not satisfied. He said to himself that a prophet was not without honor save in his own country, but he had been lately, or rather until lately, getting into an odious habit of turning proverbs upside down, and it occurred to him that a country is sometimes not without honor save for its own prophet. Then he laughed, and for the rest of the day felt more as he used to feel before he had heard Mr. Hawke's sermon. He returned to Cambridge for the long vacation of 1858, none too soon, for he had to go in for the voluntary theological examination, which bishops were now beginning to insist upon. He imagined all the time he was reading that he was storing himself with the knowledge that would best fit him for the work he had taken in hand. In truth, He was cramming for a pass. In due time he did pass, creditably, and was ordained deacon with half a dozen others of his friends in the autumn of 1858. He was then just 23 years old.